Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the oldest crimes. Before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. I will be using the My Favorite Things It's Penguining to Look a Lot Like Christmas stamp set. Adorable penguins. I will be stamping them with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink on a piece of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I will be using my Misty stamp positioner to stamp the images. I will stamp them twice because they are brand new out of the package to me, and they will not stamp perfectly the first time. I will also be leaving the images in my Misty in case I need to stamp over them when I am done, and I will be coloring with my Copic markers. This is a bit of a long one, so grab a blanket, grab your beverage, get comfy, and let's talk about some crime. So, our journey today takes us to the state of Maryland. We are on state number 19 alphabetically. On April 28, 1788, Maryland became the 7th state to ratify the U.S. Constitution. As one of the original 13 colonies of England, Maryland was founded by George Calvert, the first Baron of Baltimore, a Catholic convert who sought to provide a religious haven for Catholics persecuted in England. In 1632, Charles I of England granted Lord Baltimore a colonial charter, naming the colony after his wife Henrietta Maria. Unlike the Pilgrims and the Puritans who rejected Catholicism in their settlements, Lord Baltimore envisioned a colony where people of different religious sects would coexist under the principle of toleration. Accordingly, in 1649, the Maryland General Assembly passed an act concerning religious expression, which enshrined this principle by penalizing anyone who reproached a fellow Marylander based on religious affiliations. Few other facts about Maryland. The judges in the Maryland Court of Appeals wear red or scarlet robes. This fashion choice derives from their connection to the English common law. Jousting, the world's oldest sport on horseback, became Maryland's official sport in the 1960s. There was a huge disagreement about the borders of Maryland and Pennsylvania, so big and so violent that professional surveyors were called in by the king to end the conflict, creating the Mason-Dixon line. Also, Maryland is the home of the sheriff's Mistress murder. Our story today has 3 major players and very little important on the early lives of each of them. So we're just going to start at the beginning of the end. Our 3 people of interest are Mary Scott, not that one. You know you were thinking Mary Queen of the Scots, not that Mary Scott. George Swearingen, or Swearingen I think is how it's pronounced, and Rachel Cunningham. George is the first to enter our story here at the beginning of the end. George Swearingen was born in Berryville, Virginia in 1800. He showed promise at a young age and, by all rights, should have lived a successful, long life. He came from a well-off family, received a good education, and when he was only 17 years old, he got a job in the office of the Clerk of Courts in Washington County, Maryland. However, George was forced to resign after 15 months due to an illness, but he turned that setback into a positive. He used his time off to study the law, and when he got better, he earned his law license. Eventually, he returned to Hagerstown to clerk for his uncle, John V. Swearingen, who had been elected county sheriff. George had developed a reputation as an admirable and respectable young man. While George was living in Hagerstown, he lived with his uncle John, and that's important in a minute. The next person to enter our stage or our story is Mary Scott. In 1823, James Scott of Cumberland, Maryland, took his daughter Mary to Hagerstown so she could attend school there. When she was in Hagerstown, she boarded with John Swearingen, who was related to her or related to her father, and George was her cousin 2 or 3 times removed. So George and Mary are now both living with their relative John. Now, some reports say that George was engaged to be married, but his family urged him to break break off that engagement to pursue Mary Scott. George wrote that he broke off his engagement a year before, and he had made the choice to court Mary. So there's a little discrepancy. George also kind of changes his story later as well, but we'll get to that. Mary was young and George was charming, and it did not take him long to win her over, and the two were married on February 24th, 1824, but it was not a marriage born out of love. George wrote, "Her prospects were being flattering, but not so more than my own. I concluded that by uniting our persons and our interest, we would have a fair start for wealth, influence, and happiness in this world." So for George, at least, this was a marriage of opportunity, the ability to get farther ahead in his life than he was already starting out. The couple continued to live with John Swearingen until 1825, when George could afford to build them a home. For a while, George's habits continued to be regular, and if he was not a truly loving husband, he was at least a kind one. He lived with her in peace, neither contradicting, denying her anything, nor setting bounds on her expenses. But as she was constantly desiring to visit her family in Cumberland, he was regularly transporting her back and forth from their home to her parents' home. So it seems that she was somewhat homesick, or maybe just didn't like her husband, and it was obvious because she regularly wanted to return to her mother's home. And it became apparent to their neighbors and friends that she wanted to not be at her home as much as she wanted to be away from her home. And it seemed that George was okay, that he was glad to be rid of her on those times when she was gone. George was a young man with a bright future. Sorry, allergies are a real thing. The Baltimore Sun said George Swearingen was one of the brightest, wealthiest, and most popular young men of Washington County. His manner and person were pleasing. He had an obliging disposition and was master of all the arts obtaining to public regard. So, people liked him. This was one side of George's personality. The other side was not so upright and law-abiding. He had an Achilles heel, and when it began to unravel, so did his life, and rather quickly. George's wife, Mary, gave birth to their first child, a girl, in November of 1825, while Mary was at her family's home in Cumberland. Her ill health after the birth wound up keeping her at the home for 6 more months. This frustrated George. His wife's frequent visits to Cumberland and the time it forced George to take off work was a point of contention in their marriage. He had to take off work to drive her there. He had to take off work to bring her back. Seems like he's finding things to argue about, but whatever, they were going by horse and buggy. It wasn't like they could just drive. And to be fair, even today, driving through Maryland is a hot mess, so you don't go anywhere fast. Anyway, I digress. George went to Cumberland to fetch his wife and daughter and return them back to Hagerstown. And on their way home, the weather turned bad as they crossed Martin's Mountain. Mary wanted to turn back to a farm that they had passed. Trying to turn the carriage around, the wheels slipped off the roadway and went over a small cliff. George jumped free, but Mary and the baby went over the hill with the carriage. The baby landed uninjured in a pile of grapevines. Mary was alive, but injured and bleeding. His following actions were deemed suspicious or odd, at the very least, and they would come back to haunt him. He left his injured wife where she was and cut the entangled horse free and let it run off. Then he took up the baby and ran a 1/4 mile back to the nearest house. He left the baby there and asked for help for his wife. She was nearly dead by the time he returned with help. She remained under a doctor's care at that farmhouse for 10 days before she was deemed strong enough to return to her mother's house in Cumberland. George stayed with her a few more days before returning to Hagerstown. He wrote that his political opponents had spread rumors that he had tried to kill his wife. His statement was, "Had it been my design, I might have fully effected it, and not having been suspected in the least." And further, if so, Mary, who lived afterwards, might have disclosed it, which she never did. So he basically was saying that if I had tried to kill my wife, I would have done it and nobody would have known. And since she didn't die, if she thought I was trying to kill her, she would have said something. However, A short time after she returned to Hagerstown, Mary's father died, which sent her back to Cumberland. And it was during these absences of his wife that George admitted to a few deviations from the path of, quote, pure living. It was the following year in June that George met Rachel Cunningham, the last of our characters to enter the story. Rachel was born in Philadelphia to a family that was wealthy enough to afford to send her to boarding school. In fact, her father was a doctor. However, her parents died. First her mother when she was 9 and her father by the time she was 14. And most of her father's money was used up settling his estate. Because she was now orphaned and destitute, she wound up living with an aunt and uncle in Bedford, Pennsylvania. Bedford was a summer resort destination, and Rachel's aunt and uncle made their money renting rooms out to visiting tourists. As Rachel grew up into a young woman, she became a desirable woman whom men seemed to notice. This would seem to point to her being a great beauty, but other reports paint her differently. Rachel was later described as a large, gross, coarse, masculine woman without a single attractive feature. Now, that could be the opinion of a wronged lover, his wife, or a friend. However, but her aunt soon found that with Rachel in the house, she could fill her rooms at double the rate. Rachel, as well, was quick to learn that she could trade her favors for jewelry and other lavish gifts. One boarder named Orlando Haverly fell in love with Rachel, and she either fell in love with him or fell in love with his money. Throughout the summer, they found opportunities to be together. At the end of the season, after Orlando had checked out, he returned, and at the prearranged time, Rachel climbed out of her bedroom window and went to his waiting carriage. They lived together, but did not marry. Orlando spoiled his lover with gifts until he caught her with another man, known only as Mr. G. The two men dueled, and Orlando lost his life. So, okay, if they're dueling over this woman, she could not have been as ugly as somebody described her. So obviously, if she was that description is from somebody who had a reason to not like her. Okay, we're just going to go that. Nobody's fighting over an ugly woman, I suppose. That was kind of harsh. Sorry. Moving on. Mr. G took Rachel to live in Annapolis with him. His two sisters who were living with him objected because he appointed Rachel the mistress of his home. And so he told them they could either like it or leave. And he moved them out. Mr. G spoiled Rachel, but after he refused to let her fire a servant and she tried to poison him, not succeeding, obviously, Mr. G sent her away. She then moved around the mid-Atlantic as the lover of many men, including a Philadelphia judge, a wealthy merchant in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. Eventually, she left them all and moved to Hagerstown, Maryland. Rachel Cunningham had gone from a courtesan to the rich and handsome to a common prostitute who took in laundry. But it was enough for George, who fell madly in love with Rachel and began going to her for more than just washing and mending. You see, with George's wife Mary spending much of her time in Cumberland with her family, George had needs, like washing and mending. George spent a lot of time with Rachel, the laundress and prostitute. George took Rachel to a Methodist camp meeting, and on the way back, he ran the buggy into a stump, wrecking the vehicle and injuring Miss Cunningham. Their affair became public knowledge in the middle of his campaign for sheriff. His political associates advised George to distance himself from Rachel, but he would not. George's known association with Rachel and the rumor that he had tried to murder his wife became more public and more discussed, and they became issues during this campaign for sheriff of Washington County in 1827. Now, the former was true. He was, in fact, having an affair with a prostitute. The latter, the rumor that he tried to kill his wife, was probably not true. Probably. As Rachel's livelihood became better known, her landlord evicted her and kept any monies that she had already paid toward rent. This only strengthened their attachment as George started paying rent for her at a home near the jail and promised to build her her own place. George started visiting her regularly and was even with her on the night of his election. But because of his charm, because of his charm, not in spite of, but because of his charm and his family name, George won the election. This was the high point of his life, which would soon turn much darker. George suspected Rachel of seeing other men, and she was. At some point, Rachel told George she was pregnant with his child. He did not believe her and claimed she had been cheating on him. Distraught, Rachel tried to commit suicide by overdosing on laudanum. A neighbor found her and called for George, who tried to summon a physician. The doctor wouldn't come and help Rachel, claiming that as George's friend, he could not participate in George's continued relationship with a woman who was not his wife. And the whole she's a prostitute thing and we'd be better off dead was mentioned as well. Anyway, George took matters into his own hand, forced her to swallow an emetic, which made her vomit, which saved her life. Rachel admitted to George he wasn't the baby's father. Now, here's the part that is sticking in my mind. This guy's supposed to be super smart, right? Okay. She asked George to write the father a letter for her, and he did, but he made the mistake of signing the letter with his own name, supposedly out of habit. Not smart, right? Before the ink was dry, he ran his finger across the signature to blot it out and signed her name over it. However, his name was still legible, and the letter was used to damage his reputation later. Despite her paternity lie, George still continued his affair, but now his infidelity was becoming common knowledge in the community. His father and his uncles and all of the men in his political life urged him to break off his relationship, if not to save his marriage, to save his career. When Mary's mother learned of George's affair, she fetched Mary and brought her back to Cumberland. George didn't even object, since he didn't have to make an excuse now to spend time with Rachel. Eventually, George did build Rachel her own home and moved her into it. When a neighbor discovered that she was in fact a prostitute, he urged George to move her somewhere else because he feared she would set a bad example for his daughters. George refused to do so, and the neighbors became increasingly agitated at Rachel's presence, and they decided to drive her out. The mob began to demolish the house, literally taking apart the house a brick at a time. So George took her into his own home and kept her there for 5 days out of fear that she would be hurt. He soon took her to a Charlestown tavern and left her there with money to live on. Then he traveled to Cumberland and told his wife he had sent her away. Mary agreed to return to Hagerstown with him. It is uncertain, even in George's own confession, whether he meant this to be a break with Rachel and a new start to his relationship with his wife, or if it was just another lie. Rachel wasn't done with George, regardless of whether he was done with her or not. At the Charleston tavern, she called herself Mrs. Swearingen and used the name to get invitations to dine with respectable families in the area. For a while, she shamelessly played her part well, calling Mrs. Scott, Mary's mom, her mother, and answering all questions about the family with ease. When the truth was discovered, George had to remove Rachel once again so there wouldn't be any more problems with the town residents. After moving her around to different short-term homes, George put Rachel up at the Tevis farm near Crepstown and began visiting her again, often making the excuse to Mary that he was traveling on official business. Keep in mind, he is the sheriff of the county now, so he probably does have some roaming he needs to do. I guess. I don't know. Not that kind of roaming. The literal traveling around checking on the county roaming. Sorry. In September of 1829, George went to Cumberland to bring his wife home from yet another visit with her parents. On the morning of September 9th, a young man driving cattle about half a mile from the Tevis farm found George sitting beside his wife's dead body and cradling his daughter in his arms. George said his wife had been thrown from a horse and died when she struck the ground head first. The coroner's inquest found that the knees of Mary's horse had been cut, probably in a fall, and they ruled Mary came to her death by act of providence, meaning it was an accident and nobody could do anything about it. She was buried in Cumberland, and it was a tragedy, in particular because Mary was the mother of a young daughter. It seemed that fate had cleared the way for George and Rachel to be together, but fate can be fickle. For George, it was a gift because it allowed him to continue his affair with Rachel Cunningham with one less impediment. This might have been the end of things, but Charity Johnson, who had helped prepare Mary's body for burial, started telling people in Cumberland that Mary had bruises on her throat and other bruises that suggested she was violently raped. She said that Mary didn't die from falling off a horse, and she wanted the body disinterred and examined. George refused, saying he did not want his wife publicly exposed. However, Mary's mother suspected that Rachel had killed Mary. The place where Mary had died was about half of a mile from where Rachel was living. Mrs. Scott asked for Mary's body to be re-examined, and George relented under public pressure. The doctors could not find anything conclusive from the decomposing body. This did little to reassure George. He felt people in Cumberland would not let the matter drop. He also worried that because of Mary's mother's suspicions, people might harm Rachel. So he rode to the Tevis farm where Rachel was staying and had her pack. Then both of them headed out for Canada on a single horse. Yeah, he's not guilty or anything, right? This move did just what George had worried would happen. It made people think that there was more to Mary's death than an accident. Doctors and lawyers examined what testimony and evidence they had, and despite not finding conclusive evidence on the body, the coroner's jury came back with a verdict that after a careful and full examination of numerous witnesses, they, the jurymen, were of the opinion that Mary C. Swearingen came to her death by the hands of her husband, George. The October 17, 1828 Hagerstown Mail newspaper carried 3 items pertaining to George Swearingen, and just for the record, these were not above the fold items. They were not even the biggest story of the paper that day, even though he's like the sheriff, right? The most important notice was that the Maryland Governor Joseph Kent had placed an $800 bounty, which is about $25,000 today, on George for his capture. The first Hagerstown Hose Company also excised George's name from its constitution created when the company formed. Apparently, he was part of the formation of this company. And the Mount Moriah Masonic Lodge kicked George out. He was no longer a member. So 3 things happened in the newspaper that day. And that kind of was big stuff, yet it was still below the fold. So I don't know. So although they intended to head to Canada, George and Rachel actually went to Kentucky. They traveled at night, and George introduced himself as Campbell to anyone they met. And when their horse gave out, George exchanged it for 2 ponies. They made it to Kentucky but couldn't relax there. A man in Elizabethtown recognized George, and another man recognized him in Owenville. They finally reached George's relatives in the Green River country, where he had hoped to rest. He told his relatives that Mary's death had been accidental and that he and Rachel were married. Neither was true, but his family believed him. George then wrote his father asking for money. When a friend came from Maryland with the money, he also told George about the reward that was being offered for his capture. His father, through the friend, advised George to head to Texas, which was still part of Mexico at this time, alone, because the authorities were seeking a couple on the run. So the idea was that they would separate and both go, I guess, in George's mind. George took his father's advice, which kind of upset Rachel. George then told her that she didn't have to go without her child and that she couldn't be happy without her child. And he asked his friend to return to Maryland and bring her child back with him to reunite with Rachel. Reunite with Rachel. Rachel replied that she did not care for the child, but was willing to accompany him without the child. Okay, they're talking about her child, and she's acting like this child is a hat or something that got left behind. Super suspicious, right? Weird. I don't know. I'm a mom. I think that's weird. But maybe other people don't. I don't know. He objected that the danger of detection would be doubled if they traveled together and promised not to forsake her. So he gave her money and kissed her, and then they parted, and his friend went with him. They put Rachel traveling by steamboat down the river, and she probably passed George, who was traveling under the name of Martin, on a floating boat down the Mississippi River. So she got, the plan was to meet up in New Orleans. So George planned to find Rachel when he got there, and then they would go on to Texas. However, George was also recognized in New Orleans. The police hunted and captured him hiding on a ship, and he spent 2 months in jail without a change of clothes, covered in mice and bugs. That's from his own account. While he was in jail, another prisoner told George that Rachel was now in New Orleans searching for him. Then George made the odd decision to tell his jailer that Rachel was in town so she could be arrested and they could be sent back to Maryland together. Dude is weird. So they were in fact captured. Rachel was captured, brought to jail, and the two of them were sent by ship from New Orleans to Baltimore, where they were transported to Cumberland, where George had been charged with murder. His would be the first murder trial in Allegheny County, Maryland. So, as a recap, Washington County Sheriff George Swearengen's murder trial in Cumberland started on August 11, 1829. Some people also suspected George's lover, Rachel Cunningham, of having a hand in the murder of George's wife, Mary. But there was not enough evidence to charge her, and George maintained that she was innocent. During the trial in Cumberland, the prosecution aired every fact and rumor about George's life that they had ever heard. The prosecution alleged that George had tried to murder his wife twice before, including the Martin's Mountain buggy accident, and another incident. Supposedly, George tried to drown his wife in a river the day before she died in the, quote, accident. The first was probably a legitimate accident. Swearingen George was a notoriously bad driver. Remember, we talked about how he and Rachel were driving a buggy and he crashed into a tree stump? Yeah. George had a reputation for being a terrible driver. The second incident, the accused attempted drowning, had no witnesses, so was counted as probably fictional. The prosecution also made the case that Mary hadn't been killed on the road where she had been found with George. George, according to the prosecution, had moved her there. The strongest evidence was that George's horse and that of his wife were tracked into and out of a thicket close to the spot where the body was found. In the thicket was a spot that was trampled and stained with blood, and a club was found. The defense also floated around some highly speculative theories. One was that Mary suffered from leukophlegmatic temperament. The defense attorney, John McMahon, argued that this made Mary susceptible to spontaneous uterine hemorrhaging. Her doctor had advised her to refrain from sex. This was offered as an explanation to why George would have needed the services of a prostitute in the first place, but also the condition was offered to explain why she appeared to have been raped before death. Okay. For good measure, the defense also speculated that Charity Johnson had attacked the body with a broomstick as to implicate George as being a rapist, which is hilarious because in those days, a man could not, quote, rape his wife. Okay, that doesn't even make sense. During the closing arguments, defense attorney Price spoke for 5 hours, and the other defense attorney, McMahon, spoke for 7 hours. They were trying to paint John as able and eloquent, as an able and eloquent man. They were staging for the newspapers and the jury and people in the courtroom. They were just trying to make this a thing, right? Think O.J. Simpson in the 1800s, right? However, according to the Baltimore Sun, when the jury was excused, they took only 10 minutes to find George guilty of murdering his wife, and the judge ordered him to hang. George was shocked. As a lawyer himself, he did not believe the prosecution had made its case. It wasn't that he had murdered his wife. It was that he hadn't murdered her in the way upon which he had been convicted. Yeah, let that sink in. From his jail cell, George dictated his confession, and admitted to killing Mary. By his account, as he and Mary had neared Tevis Farm, Mary had been insistent on seeing the tenants. She knew they owned this farm. He had tried to convince her otherwise because he knew Rachel was the, quote, tenant living there. Mary finally let her husband know that her mother had already told her that Rachel was the one living at the farm. George said the couple then had an argument, and Mary turned her horse away from him toward the farm. In anger, George says he hit her on the back of the head with all his strength. She fell headfirst onto the road. He dismounted and saw she was dead. With his daughter's cries confusing him, yes, their daughter was there. With his daughter's cries confusing him, George sought to take the body to a stonier place before sounding the alarm. Her body fell off the horse 3 times, which George says accounts for the bruising. George also then cut his wife's knees. Okay, let me rephrase that again. George then said that he cut the knees of his wife's horse to make it look like the horse had tripped. Jerk, what did that horse ever do to you? I'm just saying. Unlike the prosecution's account, George insisted that the murder had not been intentional, nor had he left the road at any time. So now he's pleading it was an accident after stating, I didn't do it. George's execution took place on a flat area on the west side of Wills Creek near the courthouse. He was escorted to the gallows by a number of companies of militia from adjoining counties and accompanied by a number of ministers from different churches. According to newspapers in the area, George was led from his cell to the gallows at 10 a.m. on October 2nd. The militia companies were made up of 6 companies of soldiers, 5 from Bedford County and 1 from Somerset County. Being the first execution in Allegheny County, it drew an immense crowd of people from far and near, old and young, and could be called a tri-state gathering, according to another of the papers of the time. His last words were that he was at peace with God and the world, and he had no fear of dying. He claimed that the Lord would recognize his repentance. He was hanged at 11:40 a.m., and although it is not the first murder in Allegheny County, it was the first execution in Allegheny County. And the strangest part of this whole thing was that when he was dead, his body was cut down from the gallows and sent home to the mother of his murdered wife. I don't think I would want that. Thank you. No, thank you. Rachel Cunningham was not tried for any part she may have played in the murder, and she disappeared from history. However, the Baltimore Sun reported she is believed to have died in an almshouse in 1869, so a poorhouse, a homeless shelter. A letter that was published in multiple newspapers after George's death, purportedly written by someone who spoke with George in his last hour, said, and he's quoting George here, "I never wanted to marry Mary, but my uncles forced me to marry her. I wished to marry somebody else," they didn't name her, "although both of his uncles, personally thought this other woman was a better young lady. They preferred Mary because her father was rich." And that, my true crime friends, is the story of the sheriff's mistress murder, although it was not the mistress who was murdered, but the wife. Kind of a weird story. I found only one picture of our cast of characters, this picture of Rachel. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Crime and Coloring. I have added a couple of other videos here for you to watch, as well as a subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did so. Leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up, and have a fabulous day.